Hi there, I'm TN or Tom Baldwin, and I'm here today in my alternate role as the book surgeon, where I'm going to be deconstructing and operating on various books and letting you know what I think of them and why. They're going to be in the science fiction and fantasy genre. Now, if you're not happy with my attire as a book surgeon, then I would love for you to leave something in the comments below. Say you'd like to see me in a white jacket or wearing a mask or perhaps on the operating table myself. Really depends on how this goes. I'd love to hear what you think, so please leave something in the comments below. Now, I'm hoping to bring you episodes of The Book Surgeon around about once a month, and I'm going to introduce you to our first patient. So our first patient today is a book that was actually written by two authors, written by Bryce and Luke Chmilenko, and the book is called Iron Prince. I can see that's in reverse there. I'll work out how to change that because while I might be a great book surgeon, I'm not necessarily so good with the technology side of things. This is the book that I'll be reviewing, and I'm going to have a little bit of a look at the patient's history with you. So, in looking at the patient history of Iron Prince, I want to talk a little bit about the authors themselves and then have a look at what led me to make this the first book that I practiced surgery on for the book surgeon. Now, I'm part of a book club, and in our book club, this was the recommended reading. We had 6 weeks to read 811 pages. Perfectly achievable, but in case you haven't guessed, this book is probably longer than it needs to be. Now, Luke Chmilenko and Bryce O'Connor are both independent authors. They're self-published, and I wish them every success. I really want to see them be successful, and they've been quite prolific already, so I have no doubt they're making more than I am in terms of their career. So well done to both gentlemen. However, this was a very divisive book in our book club. It was the first one that had been really divisive. And so that's why it's the one that I chose to review this time. So we had some people in our book club. This first gentleman, I'll just give him the name Joel. And Joel said, he had a balanced sort of perspective. He said, I found the book compelling, as in I couldn't stop reading it until it was finished. But then he also said, aspects of the story style were unappealing to me conceptually. So Joel had a fairly balanced point of view. I thought that was quite interesting to see that it still drew him in regardless of that, which tells you something about the quality of the writing. However, we also had alternate points of view. We had another guy who I'll just call Nate, and Nate said the book's a cracker. That's what he said. He actually read it twice. I think he did it on audiobook, but he read it twice in the 6-week period. That's how much he absolutely loved this book, Iron Prince. So, a different perspective to Joel's. He was certainly a big fan of it. We had a third perspective, and this was from a guy who I'm going to call Cliff. Now, Cliff is a head teacher of English. He is really quite passionate about literature, and here are some of the things that Cliff said. I can only comment on the first 200 pages because that's where I stopped. Life's too short. He followed that up with, it wasn't necessarily difficult to read, but simplistic, predictable, and frankly, boring. Used the commas very deliberately there to lead into boring. And then said, oh dear, I would actually rather play a video game for 8 to 10 hours than read this book. At least it would be an authentic example of the form. Now, this was actually a back and forth conversation that Cliff and I were having together. So you can guess perhaps my perspective on the book as well, but I'll share a little bit more about that as we look at the different parts of the book's body that I want to talk about today. The first thing I'm going to do now is a top to toe of this book. So we're going to have a look at the skin of the book. We're going to have a look at the cover. So I'm going to put this cover up before you. Now, I've just learned that even though it looks in reverse on my camera, it's not in reverse for you when I went and checked back through the footage. Shows you how good I am with technology. Oh, I'm sure I'll get better. Right, so here we have a look at this cover. Now, I had a little bit of a look online, and a lot of people are unhappy with the cover. And there's a simple reason for that. The reason why they're unhappy with the cover is it's a spoiler. It does spoil, once you're reading the book, what is going to happen to the lead character. I can understand that frustration. However, especially for a self-published author, the cover is everything. It's the thing that convinces someone to read a book they haven't otherwise had a go at. And so this cover does that. It tells us the genre straight away. We can see there's sci-fi with perhaps some fantasy elements, and there's a real cyberpunk feel to it. And I think if you're looking at subgenres, cyberpunk is the right spot to put this book. So for that reason, I want to say this is actually an effective cover. I think they've really made some good choices with regard to it. As I said, I can see people's frustration. I don't think the front cover, though, is the biggest problem with it. For me, the biggest problem is the blurb and the very first words in the blurb. On the back here, it says, in big blue writing, Radon Ward will become a god. Radon Ward is the lead character. That's this guy in this book. And the problem with this is, how are you going to raise the stakes after that? How are we ever going to fear that Radon Ward is going to get into any trouble or have any issues with such an obvious exclamation on the back cover of the book? So I think that's really where they've let themselves down, that the combined two components actually mean it's hard for us to sympathize with this character throughout. And so they've done themselves a disservice, I think, with that combination. So overall, good cover, visually appealing, but the blurb, I think they probably could have made a few different choices. Now we're going to have a bit of a look at the skeleton of the book, a bit of an x-ray, and have a look at the writing style, the language use, the editing, all of those structural elements that are really important for telling a story. And I have to say that our two authors here have really let themselves down. I remember reading the prologue, and in the prologue I found 6 mistakes. It's 5 pages long. You cannot have those sorts of editing mistakes. Now, I understand not everyone is good at spelling or grammar or punctuation. But if you're not, that's why you get someone else in. They've actually got 2 authors working on this to try to make sure there aren't many errors. There were literally hundreds of errors littered through this book. Now, I'm hoping they've redone the book since then and they've improved a lot of those mistakes. But on 3 separate occasions, Radon Ward, Ray as he's known for short, his name was spelled incorrectly. This is your protagonist's name spelled incorrectly. R-E-Y and R-A-Y. So spelled 2 different ways incorrectly rather than the R-E-I they use throughout it. So to me, that's a major issue, a major concern that editing hasn't picked that up. And Luke, Bryce, if you're watching, I'm very happy to read through your next book beforehand and maybe just pick up on a few of those errors that you might have missed. But if you don't want that, that's fine as well. Now, there were also some other problems with the use of tautology and poor language use. So I just want to read out a few of them to you. So there was a sentence that had a little component in it, correction to be manually corrected. What else would you do with a correction? You would correct it. So that bit certainly could have been rewritten. Now, these mistakes happen. However, we also had disquiet, trepidation put together. The 2 things mean the same thing. You feel disquiet, you feel trepidation, you're concerned about something. Nervous anxiety. That one's even more obvious. Disgruntled fury. Now, those 2 are different. But disgruntled means, you're a bit irritated or frustrated by something. Fury means you're rah! Disgruntled fury, I don't think you can be both at once. So I think, again, that use of language. But one of my personal, most frustrating ones was an emaciating lecture. That is, a lecture that makes you look thin and sick. I don't think... Look, writers are always trying to come up with new ways to describe something, but emaciating lecture just doesn't work for me. Maybe if I read the whole 811 pages of this book and refused to eat in that time, then that might make it an emaciating book. But I don't think you can describe a lecture as emaciating, even trying to be as creative as you possibly can. So those are a few of the problems that I saw when I had a look at the X-ray of this book. Now it's time for everyone's favourite procedure, the colonoscopy. Let's have a look at the guts of this book, essentially. We're going to have a look at the plot. So I did have a lot of problems with the plot. I have to be honest with you here. So first of all, as Cliff said before, I have to agree with him. I thought it was really predictable. The way that the whole story was constructed was quite predictable. And a lot of that comes back to that blurb. We know what's going to happen to Radon Ward. So that's part of the problem. The authors employ some fake suspense at times. Now, what I mean by fake suspense is there's this moment in the book where they're revealed who, among the key characters, who the two characters will each be fighting. And what the authors do is, for the first character, they don't reveal to the audience who it is. Now, that's fine. You cannot do that, and that can create suspense, and that can be really effective. But if you're going to do that, you need to be consistent with it. And so the authors then go to another character, and they say exactly who that friend of Radon Ward is fighting. What's more, the payoff for who the character Radon was going to be fighting, which we discovered 2 chapters later, just isn't big enough to warrant that level of suspense. So I feel they tried to create a fake suspense there, and it really, really frustrated me when I was reading it. They also spend large portions of chapters watching characters fight who we've never met before and going into pages and pages of detail of these fights without us having any affection whatsoever for any of these characters, any attachment to them, because we've only just met them. And even in the fight, there's this sense that you don't really care who wins. So again, it's a fight that could just be cut out entirely. These are meaningless words put on the page as far as I was concerned. They describe armour somewhere between 20 and 30 times, the different armour different people are wearing. It's fine to do that for your key characters and to show that development and that sort of thing. But to keep doing it for these characters we know nothing about is really, 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 for me anyway, I found it boring. Now, to be fair with that, this book is not directed at me, because my biggest complaint about this book is that it reads like a computer game. Indeed, that was the first thing that I said when I first messaged Cliff about reading this book. I have a bias here. I am of the opinion that movies that are then converted into literature, and I use that term loosely, are generally among the worst written books that you might find. And I have to be honest, converting something that could be a video game into a book as well didn't work for me. Now, there is a huge audience for this, so I'm not denying the veracity of it, the relevance of it. This is a book that appeals to a lot of people. So I need to keep in mind with that even though I don't like these things, and even though it read like a video game to me, there are people out there who will like it. And you'll see in my ratings how I'm going to manage that tricky little dilemma. Now we're getting serious. This is an angiogram. We're looking at the heart. We're looking at the characters. Now I'm going to have a look at the lead character, Radon Ward, and a few other characters in the novel as well. A couple of fairly significant ones, and also a fairly minor one, but one who I didn't see a lot of motivation for. So the first character is Radon Ward. He's set up in a way that makes you, no matter what, have to sympathise with him. He has a very specific and genuine bone disease that's mentioned several times in the book. However, that bone disease does very little to hold him back throughout. Now, we're given all these situations talking about his surgeries when he was younger and talking about the pain that he feels and all that sort of thing. But there's not a lot that's real about it, and we don't experience a lot of it. In fact, it's quite some time before they explain what the surgeries are, the authors. And for that reason, I found it hard to sympathise. Indeed, they tried to set it up that every single thing was stacked against Radon Ward. People, peers, his teachers, all sorts of things were stacked against him to such a ridiculous extent. It was just saying, please sympathise with my character. And for me, that made him a cardboard cutout. I couldn't really engage with him. The other problem with that was Radon Ward didn't really have any flaws. He had perhaps occasionally a smart mouth. That was about it. But you didn't get to see any of his real character defects in this book. And these days, in this world we live in, we actually want characters we can see who are real. Not just characters who we're told feel sorry for. We want characters who are real, who struggle with their own morality, ethical dilemmas, their own personality traits that get in their way. And we don't see any of that with Radon. Now then, I want to go to two other characters as well. His best friend, whose name just escapes me at the moment, but anyway, his best friend is a girl who's said to be bisexual in the book, and she's quite an interesting character. She's got a lot of personality. She's reasonably engaging. However, I had a real problem with another aspect of the book, and that was that his enemy among his peers, Logan Grant, in a fight that he and Logan have together, the fights are all simulations. I haven't gone too much into that because I don't want to spoil everything about the book. But in a simulated fight he has with Logan, once Logan wins that fight, Logan is, by the way, twice the size of Radon. Once Logan wins that fight and they call the fight off, he comes and he attacks Ray again and keeps smashing at him in a way that gets him basically 6 days in what they call the brig, 6 days where he's locked away from the rest of his companions and classmates. Now, that's a pretty serious offence, you would have to say. Somehow, Ray's best friend falls for this guy, even though he's done this reprehensible thing. And he does something that kind of redeems himself to her, at least in her eyes. But I found that difficult to swallow, that she would then want to be involved in a relationship, and you give him this sense that that's about to happen between she and Logan Grant by the end of the book. So I found that really problematic. The final one was that there was a teacher who was deliberately discriminating against Ray, who's already got everything stacked against him, by the way, and set up the fights so that they were ones that Ray was unlikely to win. Now, he did that illegally and dishonestly. And the worst he got was a reprimand from his superior officer, who actually happens to be the surrogate uncle of the girl who Ray has a bit of a crush on as well. So complicated sort of love story going on there. And we're not really given a strong reason why this guy does that, why this teacher is so unwilling to help Ray and to make his life as difficult as possible to discourage him. Frankly, it's abusive. And I don't see how a reprimand could be seen as enough, even in this world, to make that happen. So for me, the characters are a bit of a thumbs down. Now I just want to go into a general checkup, once again, of this book, Iron Prince, that we're reviewing during this month. Now I'm going to start with a negative, but then I want to get into a few of the positives as well. The dialogue in this book is really quite poor. First of all, it's often used as an info dump. We will see paragraphs of a 1/2 to 1 page long, which are just explaining a whole heap of information about the fights or the system or the background of the place. Exposition is better written as exposition. A lot of people make the mistake, I think, and I've done it myself, of thinking that dialogue is a way to show instead of telling. But if all you're doing is someone talking for 15 straight sentences, it's not real. It's very rare that we find those situations in real life where that happens. And so really that approach with dialogue is not great. The other problem I had was these characters are meant to be 18 years old. The dialogue in them, I'm an ex-teacher, the dialogue in them is more like they're 13 or 14. There's just not enough maturity for me to believe the age that they're set at. So I feel these are two areas that the authors could really work on and look at when they release the second book later this year. However, there were some really good aspects to the way they structured the book as well. One of the things that has become reasonably popular, and it was done by Frank Herbert in June, it's done by Brandon Sanderson in a lot of his work, is the use of epigrams, little sections from other texts that they use at the start of a chapter to communicate something else about what might happen with the chapter. Now, some of the epigrams seemed to me a bit pointless, an epigram for the sake of the epigram, but some of them were really good for revealing other little back pieces of information that were quite interesting and relevant. So I thought they were used reasonably well. As I said before, the cover works really well. The authors build tension at different times in different fights. They show Ray's creativity. So he's more than a one-dimensional character. He's at least a two-dimensional. I'd love to see him get that third dimension of his flaws, though. Now, the world building in this book is also okay. You get a sense of the place where they are. You get a little bit of a sense of the distant war going on that these guys, some of them are training for to be part of and whatnot. So the world building is okay. I believe the world. I was happy with the world. So I think they've done a pretty good job of that. Although, as I said, quite a bit of it is done through that dialogue exposition. I think they could rethink that. The other thing that these guys are obviously passionate about is action. And there's action aplenty in this book. And a lot of that action is really well written and quite easy to follow. Sometimes they get a little bit too complicated with parts of the body and where they are. But on the whole, I would say that's a real strength of this book. So, I performed surgery on Iron Prince. And now it's time for me to give you my prognosis, what I see in terms of the future of this book. Now, I'm going to give you two different prognoses. The first one will be my own personal opinion, and then the other will be what I think readers of that genre might feel, people at whom this is directed. So for me, I'm afraid I can only give this book 2 stars, urgent surgery required. And I've had a little bit of a talk about the reasons why that might be the case. But I think that this book needs a major makeover. You could cut probably a third of it and actually make it a much more compelling novel. You could tighten up those issues with dialogue, those issues with character, help Ray to fail, not just because he's weak, but because of some flaws in his character, things like that. I think there are a lot of things that could be done to improve this novel overall. However, this book wasn't written for me. I'm not the obvious audience. Even though I love fantasy, I like quite a lot of sci-fi, this book wasn't written for me. And so I want to take that into account. Now, looking online, these guys on Amazon have 6,615, last time I looked, that was yesterday. They had that number of ratings and reviews on Amazon, which is a huge number for a book that's only 2 years old. So that shows that there's a real audience for this book. My book, which is my first book, which has been out for 3 years, has got 41. And I've tried really hard to get ratings, and perhaps someone should dissect my book in the same way because I'm perhaps too close to it. So with that in mind, they also have 4.8 stars on average, by the way, which is a huge rating, brilliant ratings on Amazon. So I really want to say that I can give this book 4 stars, and 4 stars would mean that they're sort of on a regular treatment plan to keep working on their writing, but I can't do it. I can't do it because of the errors in the writing itself. To misspell your main character's name just shows a lack of care and attention to detail for something that you're passionate about, for a book you're passionate about. So I'm going to give it, from other perspective, from readers' perspectives, 3.5 stars. You could probably live with it. So thanks for watching the first episode of The Book Surgeon. My website is www.tnbaldwin.com. If you liked this video or want to comment below, if you want to trash my opinion or if you want to give a difference of opinion, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to back and forth with you. If you think there's anything that's missing from this, or there's a novel that you'd really like me to do in the fantasy and science fiction genre, do a review on, do some book surgery on, then I'd really love to do that. So please like, subscribe, or otherwise comment on this video. I'll look forward to seeing you in another month's time. I think I know which book I'm already going to do.